The Curious Compass. The story begins in the quiet suburbs of Colorado, where a man named Ethan Wilder, a history professor at a local university, found himself at a crossroads in his marriage to Margot. They had been together for 13 years, and while the love they shared still burned, it flickered differently now, like the warmth of embers rather than the crackling flames it once had been. One night, over a bottle of Merlot and soft jazz humming from the speakers, Margot brought up the idea. What if we allowed ourselves to explore, to feel what it's like to love someone else? She said softly, her eyes fixed on Ethan. The question hung in the air like an unspoken secret. Ethan felt his stomach twist. Margot had always been a free spirit, an artist who lived in color and chaos, but this was uncharted territory. At first, Ethan resisted. The idea of an open marriage felt like it might unravel everything they had built. But over time, Margot's earnestness, her assurances that their foundation would remain, began to chip away at his reservations. With hesitant agreement, Ethan allowed their lives to veer into the unknown. The cafe stranger Ethan's first steps into this new arrangement were awkward. Dating apps were a labyrinth he didn't understand, and his attempts at conversation often ended in polite rejections. That is, until he stumbled into a secondhand bookshop downtown. It was there, among the dusty shelves, that he met Isla, a violinist whose fingers danced across the pages of an antique book on musical theory. She had a laugh that sounded like the notes of a symphony, and her eyes carried a depth that both intimidated and intrigued him. They met again, this time at the cafe next door, where their conversation spilled out like the pages of an unwritten novel. Isla spoke of her travels through Europe, of playing in dimly lit train stations and serenading strangers. Ethan told her of his love for history and the ancient stories he taught his students. Over weeks that turned to months, their connection deepened. Isla was unlike anyone Ethan had ever known, a muse of spontaneity who coaxed him out of his careful routines. They spent evenings exploring hidden corners of the city, laughing until their cheeks hurt, and sharing secrets they hadn't even told themselves. The tangle of love Ethan couldn't deny it any longer. He had fallen in love with Isla. It was a different kind of love than what he felt for Margot. Not better, not worse, but new and electric. But with this revelation came guilt. Margot had opened the door to this arrangement, yet Ethan had never expected to stumble upon something so profound. One evening, he confessed everything to Margot, bracing for anger or sadness. Instead, she listened quietly, her face unreadable. "Ethan," she said after a long silence, "I wanted us to find freedom in this. But freedom comes with choices, and choices come with consequences. What do you want now?" The compass. Within Ethan realized that the answer wasn't simple. He loved Margot, the woman who had built a life with him, who had stood by him through joy and heartbreak. But Isla had awakened something in him, a reminder that life was vast and unpredictable, that love could take many forms. In the end, Ethan chose to pause. He stepped back from Isla, not because his feelings for her were any less, but because he needed to honor the roots he had planted with Margot. Together, they sought therapy, revisited the stories that made them, and began to redefine what their love could look like. Isla, ever graceful, understood. She left him with a note tucked into his favorite history book. "Love is a compass, Ethan. Sometimes it points us home. Sometimes it leads us to places we've never imagined. Thank you for letting me be part of your journey." The aftermath years later, Ethan sat in his study, reflecting on that chapter of his life. Margot had found her own adventure during their time of exploration, but ultimately chose to stay by his side. Their love was not the same as it had been. It was stronger, more honest, and beautifully imperfect. And though Isla had drifted into his past, she remained a reminder of the paths we walk when we dare to step off the beaten trail. In the end, Ethan realized, love isn't about one destination. It's a journey of endless horizons, and every twist, every turn, shapes the story of who we are. The Path of Two Rivers. After Ethan's heartfelt conversation with Margot, life seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Margot, though hurt by the intensity of his connection with Isla, didn't lash out. Instead, she surprised Ethan by suggesting they take a trip together, just the two of them, away from the distractions and complexities of their new arrangement. "I think we've been so focused on exploring outside of us," she said, "that we've forgotten to explore us. Let's see if there's still a map to follow." They rented a small cabin in the Rockies, surrounded by snow-draped pines and the quiet hum of nature. For a week, they hiked, cooked together, and revisited old memories. Margot brought a sketchbook, capturing moments of their shared days, a sunrise over the mountains, Ethan laughing as he struggled to light a campfire, their intertwined hands on a cold morning walk. One night, as they sat by the fire, Margot leaned into Ethan and whispered, "I love you, but I don't want to lose myself in loving you, and I don't want you to lose yourself in me either. Maybe love isn't about being everything to one another. It's about being enough." Her words lingered in Ethan's mind long after they returned home. He realized Margot wasn't asking him to abandon what he felt for Isla. She was asking him to rediscover who they were as individuals within the framework of their marriage. Isla's quiet exit. Ethan knew he couldn't move forward without confronting the depth of his feelings for Isla. One rainy afternoon, he invited her to meet him at the park where they had once spent hours talking under the shade of a willow tree. Isla arrived wearing her usual confidence, but Ethan noticed a softness in her expression, a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. "I've been thinking," Ethan began, his voice heavy with emotion. "What we have, it's real, Isla, but I'm standing at a crossroads, and I need to choose the path that doesn't leave me divided." Isla's gaze dropped to her hands, but she didn't cry or protest. Instead, she nodded slowly. "I knew this might happen, Ethan. What we shared, it was like music in an empty room. Beautiful, but not meant to last forever." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "I wrote something for you. A story about a man who found love in the wilderness but had to return to the village he called home. You can read it when you're ready." Isla left that day, walking into the misty horizon with her violin case in hand. Ethan sat on the bench for a long time, clutching the notebook, his heart heavy with both gratitude and sorrow. Rebuilding. With Margot, Ethan poured himself into his relationship with Margot. But the work wasn't easy. They began seeing a marriage counselor who helped them untangle the complexities of their emotions. The sessions were raw and unfiltered. Margot confessed her fears of being abandoned, and Ethan admitted to feeling suffocated before their open marriage experiment began. Through it all, they learned to communicate in ways they never had before. They set boundaries, acknowledged their flaws, and celebrated their victories, no matter how small. Slowly, the cracks in their foundation were filled, not with the naive idealism of their younger years, but with the tempered strength of two people who had weathered storms together. Margot even began to explore her own creative independence. She started teaching art classes and joined a local gallery where her paintings, once confined to their home, were displayed and admired. Watching her thrive brought Ethan an unexpected joy. A letter from the past. 1 year after Isla's departure, Ethan stumbled upon the leather-bound notebook she had given him. He had kept it on a shelf in his study, unsure if he was ready to confront the emotions it might stir. With a deep breath, he opened it. Inside was a short story, handwritten in Isla's elegant script. It told the tale of a man who wandered into the wilderness, where he met a muse who taught him to see beauty in the smallest details. A blade of grass, the ripple of a stream. The man fell in love with her, but as the seasons changed, he realized his heart was tied to the village he had left behind. The final lines struck Ethan deeply. Love isn't about staying. It's about teaching, growing, and letting go when the time is right. Some people are meant to be chapters, not endings. Ethan closed the notebook, tears streaming down his face. Isla had given him not just her love, but also the gift of perspective, a reminder that life is a mosaic of moments, and each piece, no matter how fleeting, adds to its beauty. The journey forward. Ethan and Margot continued to evolve, their relationship no longer constrained by the rigid definitions they had once held. They weren't just husband and wife, they were partners, individuals, and co-creators of a life that embraced imperfection. The winds of change life for Ethan and Margot became a tapestry of rediscovery after their open marriage chapter had closed. But the changes they had experienced left marks, some tender, others scarred. Their newfound honesty brought them closer, but it also forced them to confront truths that had long been buried. One evening, while they were enjoying dinner on the porch of their suburban home, Margot leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. "Ethan," she began, "do you ever think about what we've lost? Not just in this experiment, but over the years? Who we were when we started out?" Ethan sipped his wine, considering her words. "I do. But I also think about what we've gained. We've grown, Margot. We're not the same people we were, and maybe that's okay." Margot smiled faintly, but didn't reply. There was something unsaid in her eyes, something Ethan couldn't quite reach. Margot's journey. Unbeknownst to Ethan, Margot had been carrying her own secret. During their open marriage, she had formed a deep bond with a man named Julian, a sculptor whose passion for life mirrored her own artistic spirit. While their relationship hadn't reached the emotional depth of Ethan and Isla's connection, it had ignited a fire in her, a reminder of who she was outside of being a wife and partner. After the experiment ended, Margot had ended things with Julian, choosing to focus on her marriage. But pieces of that connection lingered in her heart, not as a betrayal, but as a reminder of her own identity. Margot threw herself into her art, pouring her emotions into canvases that told stories of love, loss, and transformation. Her work began to attract attention at the gallery, and soon she was invited to showcase a solo exhibition. Ethan was proud of her accomplishments, but as Margot's world expanded, he began to feel like an outsider looking in. Their evenings together grew quieter, their conversations less intimate. A sudden encounter. One afternoon, Ethan decided to surprise Margot at the gallery. As he walked through the sunlit space, admiring her vibrant paintings, he saw a man standing by one of her pieces, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with silver-streaked hair. The man turned, and Ethan immediately recognized him. It was Julian. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the weight of unspoken truths hanging in the air. Julian broke the silence first, offering a polite smile. "You must be Ethan," he said, extending a hand. Ethan shook it, his grip firm. "And you're Julian." Julian nodded, his expression calm. "I was admiring Margot's work. She's brilliant, isn't she?" "She is," Ethan replied, his voice steady but guarded. The encounter was brief, but it left Ethan rattled. On the drive home, he couldn't shake the image of Julian standing in the gallery, so at ease in a space that felt sacred to Margot, a reckoning. That evening, Ethan confronted Margot. "I saw Julian today," he said, his tone even but firm. Margot froze, her paintbrush hovering over a canvas. "You did?" "At the gallery," Ethan continued, "he seemed familiar, with your work. Margot set the brush down and turned to face him. Ethan, Julian was part of a chapter in my life that's over. He doesn't mean anything to me now, but I won't deny that he was important to me during that time. Just like Isla was to you. Ethan nodded, but the tension between them was palpable. It's not about him, Margot. It's about us. I feel like we're growing apart again. Like we're living in separate worlds. Margot's eyes softened. I felt it too. And I think it's because we've been so focused on trying to fix what was broken that we haven't stopped to ask ourselves what we truly want now. Rediscovering the us. Margot suggested something bold, a fresh start. She proposed they sell their house and travel together, leaving behind the routines and memories that tied them to their past. Ethan was hesitant at first, but the idea grew on him. They had spent so long trying to repair their old life. Maybe it was time to build a new one. Within months, they had sold their home, packed their belongings into a camper van, and set off on a cross-country journey. They visited national parks, small towns, and bustling cities, letting the road guide them. The freedom of the open road brought them closer in ways they hadn't anticipated. They laughed over campfires, shared stories from their youth, and rediscovered the joy of simply being together. The final note one evening, as they camped by a quiet lake in Vermont, Ethan pulled out Isla's notebook. He read it aloud to Margot, sharing the story that had once brought him to tears. When he finished, Margot smiled. It's beautiful, and she was right. Some people are meant to be chapters, not endings. Ethan nodded, his heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment. But you and I, we're the story, and I want to keep writing it with you. The Road Unwritten. Ethan and Margot's journey across the country wasn't just about seeing new places. It was about rediscovering the essence of who they were, as individuals and as partners. The open road became their canvas, and every mile brought with it a new lesson, a new story. One evening, parked on a bluff overlooking the Grand Canyon, Margot set up her easel while Ethan flipped through an old atlas they had picked up at a roadside antique store. Did you know this canyon is over 5 million years old? Ethan said, his voice filled with wonder. Margot laughed as she sketched the fading light on the canyon walls. Leave it to you to turn every moment into a history lesson. It's who I am, Ethan replied with a grin. But seriously, think about it. This place has weathered time, storms, and change. And look how beautiful it still is. Margot paused, her brush hovering above the canvas. Kind of like us, huh? Ethan looked at her, and for a moment, the enormity of the canyon seemed to pale in comparison to the woman in front of him. Yeah, he said softly. Kind of like us. Unexpected companions. As they ventured further, they found themselves picking up unexpected companions, both human and otherwise. In a small town in New Mexico, they met a retired schoolteacher named Lois, who had been traveling alone in her vintage Airstream since her husband passed away. She joined them for a few days, sharing her stories of love, loss, and resilience around their campfire. Lois became a temporary mentor for Margot, encouraging her to submit her work to a national art competition. In Oregon, they stumbled upon a stray dog, a scrappy mutt with mismatched eyes, wandering near their campsite. Margot, ever the nurturer, insisted on taking him in. They named him Tango because of the way he seemed to dance with excitement every time they stopped the van. Tango became their constant companion, bringing a new energy to their journey. He forced them to slow down, to take longer walks, and to find joy in the simplest moments. The letters they wrote. As they traveled, Ethan and Margot began a new tradition, writing letters to each other. Every week they would exchange a handwritten note detailing their thoughts, fears, dreams, and the things they loved about one another. One letter from Ethan read, Margot, every morning I wake up to the sound of your laughter, or the sight of you chasing Tango through the grass. and I'm reminded of why I fell in love with you. You make the world brighter, more vibrant. I know I've made mistakes. I've stumbled, lost my way. But every step has led me back to you. And for that, I'm endlessly grateful. Margot's reply was equally heartfelt. Ethan, you are my anchor and my compass, all at once. When I look at you, I see the boy who kissed me under the stars and the man who's still willing to fight for us. We've faced storms that I thought might drown us, but here we are, stronger, braver, and more alive than ever. Let's keep writing this story, one page at a time. These letters became treasures, reminders of their commitment to keep growing together. The detour that changed everything. Their travels eventually led them to a remote artist's retreat in the Appalachian Mountains. Margot had received an invitation to spend 3 months working on a collection for a major gallery exhibition. At first, Ethan wasn't sure how he felt about staying in one place for so long. But when they arrived, he was captivated by the retreat's charm. An old converted lodge surrounded by towering trees, with a cozy library where he could lose himself in books while Margot painted. The retreat also introduced them to a diverse group of artists, writers, and dreamers. Among them was a playwright named Camille, who was fascinated by Ethan's love for history. She convinced him to collaborate on a historical drama set during the Harlem Renaissance. For the first time in years, Ethan felt creatively alive. As Margot worked on her paintings, he poured his energy into writing, rediscovering a passion he had almost forgotten. The opening night. 3 months later, Margot's collection was unveiled at a prestigious gallery in New York City. The exhibition, titled Fragments of Us, featured pieces inspired by their travels, a painting of the Grand Canyon, a portrait of Lois, an abstract work symbolizing the intertwining rivers of their love. The gallery buzzed with admiration, but the highlight of the evening came when Margot took Ethan's hand and led him to the center of the room. "This," she said, gesturing to a large, breathtaking painting, "is my favorite piece." It was a portrait of Ethan, sitting by a campfire with Tango at his side, the stars reflected in his glasses. "It's called The Compass," Margot said, "because no matter where we go, you're the one who always brings me back to myself." Ethan's throat tightened as he looked at the painting. The cottage by the lake. The cottage was like something out of a postcard, nestled among tall pines, its weathered stone chimney puffing smoke on cold mornings, and its front porch offering an uninterrupted view of the shimmering lake. Tango seemed to approve of the move immediately, racing around the yard and barking at his reflection in the water. Margot turned the barn behind the house into her art studio, filling it with canvases, brushes, and the golden glow of sunlight streaming through its wide windows. Ethan claimed a corner of the cottage as his writing nook, where an old oak desk faced the lake, offering him the perfect view for inspiration. For the first time in years, their lives felt both expansive and grounded. The rhythm of their days. Each morning, they began with a quiet ritual, coffee on the porch, watching the mist rise off the lake. Margot often sketched while Ethan jotted down ideas for his latest novel. "Do you think Tango dreams?" Margot asked one morning, watching the dog twitch in his sleep by the fireplace. "Probably," Ethan replied. "Maybe he's running through a field or chasing squirrels." Margot laughed. "Or maybe he's dreaming of all the places we've taken him. Dogs deserve their own stories, too." Their days unfolded gently, punctuated by long walks through the woods, impromptu, swims in the lake, and evenings spent cooking together. Ethan discovered a knack for baking, while Margot perfected her grandmother's stew recipe. Sometimes they invited neighbors over for dinner, an elderly couple named Harold and Linda, who had lived by the lake for decades, and a young beekeeper named Olivia, who brought jars of wildflower honey as gifts. Margot's studio. The barn-turned studio quickly became a sanctuary for Margot. She began offering weekend workshops, teaching local children and adults to paint. The workshops grew popular, attracting not just locals, but also visitors from nearby towns. One student, a shy teenager named Ellie, stood out to Margot. Ellie rarely spoke, but had an incredible talent for capturing emotions in her work. Margot took her under her wing, encouraging her to submit her paintings to regional art contests. One evening, Ellie handed Margot a small wrapped canvas. "I painted this for you," she said quietly. Margot unwrapped it to reveal a portrait of herself standing in the studio, paintbrush in hand, a warm smile on her face. "It's beautiful," Margot said, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Ellie." That night, Margot showed the painting to Ethan, tears in her eyes. "This is why I do what I do," she said, "to help someone like Ellie see their own brilliance." Ethan's writing. While Margot poured her heart into teaching, Ethan found himself drawn deeper into the world of historical fiction. His latest project, inspired by their travels, followed the lives of two star-crossed lovers during the Great Depression. He often shared drafts with Margot, who would read them aloud by the fire, her voice bringing his characters to life. "You're getting better at this," she teased one night after finishing a chapter. "Better?" Ethan laughed. "I'll take that as high praise from you." As the months passed, Ethan's manuscript took shape. When he finally sent it off to his publisher, he felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The first winter. There. First winter in Vermont was harsh, but magical. Snow blanketed the landscape, turning the lake into a frozen wonderland. Tango loved bounding through the drifts, his fur coated in frost. Ethan and Margot spent snowy evenings wrapped in blankets, sipping hot cocoa and playing board games by the fire. One night, during a particularly fierce storm, the power went out. "Well, this is romantic," Margot said, lighting a cluster of candles. Ethan pulled out his guitar, something he hadn't touched in years, and played an old folk song they both loved. Margot joined in, her voice soft but sure. When the song ended, Ethan said, "We should do this more often." "What? Lose power?" Margot joked. "No," Ethan said, smiling. "Make music together. Spring renewal." When the snow finally melted, the lake came alive again. Margot began painting a new series inspired by the changing seasons, while Ethan started research for his next book. One morning, while walking by the water, Margot stopped suddenly. "Ethan, look!" In the reeds by the shore, a family of ducks waddled into view, a mother and her tiny ducklings. "They're beautiful," Ethan said, pulling out his phone to snap a picture. Margot grabbed his arm. "No, don't. Let's just watch." They stood there in silence, the ducks a symbol of the simple, profound beauty that surrounded them. A new chapter, together. As the months turned into years, Ethan and Margot's lives in Vermont became a reflection of the life they had always dreamed of, one filled with creativity, connection, and quiet joy. The first summer. Their first summer by the lake unfolded like a series of vivid paintings. Margot captured the shifting light on the water with each sunrise and sunset, while Ethan grew fascinated with the history of their small Vermont town, Greenhaven. Greenhaven was a close-knit community with its own quirks and traditions. Every July, the town hosted a Lake Lantern Festival, a decades-old tradition where the townsfolk built small paper lanterns, lit them with candles, and released them onto the water at dusk. Margot was immediately inspired. She spent weeks crafting a lantern shaped like the barn where she painted, each detail lovingly rendered. Ethan, with less artistic flair, settled on a simple design, a lantern shaped like an open book. When the evening of the festival arrived, they joined their neighbors at the water's edge. Harold and Linda, the elderly couple who lived nearby, waved them over, offering slices of homemade apple pie. As the lanterns floated out onto the lake, their warm glow reflecting off the still water, Ethan leaned over and whispered, "I think this is my favorite thing we've done so far." Margot smiled. "It's magical, isn't it? Like watching everyone's dreams drift into the universe." A visit from the past. Their peaceful summer was interrupted one day by an unexpected visitor, Isla. She had been in New York for work and decided to take a detour to Vermont after seeing Ethan's social media post about their new home. When Isla arrived, Margot greeted her warmly, though there was a slight tension in the air. Ethan was surprised by how much his feelings toward Isla had changed. What once felt like a whirlwind romance now seemed like a distant, bittersweet memory. Over dinner, Isla shared stories of her latest travels, her vibrant personality filling the room. But as the evening wore on, she grew quieter, her gaze lingering on Ethan and Margot. "You two seem different," Isla said finally. Ethan nodded. "We are. I think Vermont has been good for us." Isla smiled, though there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "I'm glad. You deserve this." When Isla left the next morning, Ethan and Margot stood on the porch, watching her car disappear down the dirt road. "Do you think she's happy?" Margot asked softly. "I hope so," Ethan said. "But I know I am." Challenges on the horizon. As idyllic as their life in Vermont seemed, it wasn't without its challenges. Margot's art workshops, while popular, began to consume more of her time and energy. She often stayed late at the studio, preparing lessons or helping her students, leaving Ethan to spend evenings alone. Ethan, meanwhile, struggled with a bout of writer's block. His next book, an ambitious tale set during the American Revolution, felt unwieldy, and he began to doubt whether he could finish it. One evening, after another long day, Margot found Ethan sitting by the lake, staring at a blank notebook. "I feel like I've lost my spark," he admitted, "like I'm trying to force something that just isn't there." Margot sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "Maybe you're putting too much pressure on yourself. Why not take a break? Let the story come to you." Ethan sighed. "I don't know if I have time for that. Deadlines don't wait." Margot smiled gently. "Deadlines might not, but life does. And sometimes, that's where the best stories come from." Finding balance. Taking Margot's advice, Ethan decided to step away from his manuscript. Instead, he began volunteering at the local historical society, helping to restore old documents and artifacts. The work reignited his love for history and provided the inspiration he needed to return to his book with fresh eyes. Meanwhile, Margot realized she needed to set boundaries with her workshops. She scaled back her schedule, dedicating more time to her own creative projects and to Ethan. Together, they found a rhythm that worked, a balance between their individual passions and their shared life. A growing community. Over time, Ethan and Margot became integral members of Greenhaven. Ethan's work at the Historical Society led to him organizing a living history weekend where locals dressed in period costumes and reenacted scenes from the town's past. Margot's art studio became a hub for creativity, attracting not only painters but also writers, musicians, and crafters. She organized seasonal art and story nights where people shared their work and supported each other's dreams. One memorable evening, a local musician named Caleb performed a hauntingly beautiful song inspired by the lake. Ethan was so moved that he asked Caleb if he could include the song's lyrics in his novel. Caleb agreed, and the collaboration became a symbol of the community's interconnectedness. A new adventure. As autumn arrived, bringing fiery reds and golds to the trees, Ethan and Margot decided to host a weekend retreat at their cottage, settling into the rhythm of Greenhaven. The town of Greenhaven welcomed Ethan and Margot like a long-lost friend, its charm unfolding in unexpected ways. The general store, run by the jovial Mr. Grady, became their regular stop for fresh produce, gossip, and the occasional homemade pie. Margot quickly befriended Lila, a florist with an eye for wild arrangements, who supplied her with fresh flowers for the studio. Ethan struck up a friendship with Raymond, the town historian, who shared tales of the Revolutionary War soldiers rumored to have camped near the lake. The couple found that Greenhaven's pace suited them. There were no deadlines to chase, no incessant noise, just the gentle ebb and flow of days marked by morning sunrises, the buzz of bees in Olivia's apiary, and the occasional clap of a summer thunderstorm. The Lake Lantern Festival. The Lake Lantern Festival was not just an event. It was the heart of Greenhaven's summer traditions. In the weeks leading up to it, the town buzzed with anticipation. The festival committee, led by Harold and Linda, enlisted Ethan and Margot to help. Ethan assisted with the historical displays, a series of boards detailing the festival's origins during the early 1900s, while Margot volunteered to organize a children's lantern-making workshop. On the day of the festival, the town green transformed into a carnival of color and laughter. Food stalls lined the edges, the scent of fried dough and fresh lemonade filling the air. Local musicians played folk songs on a makeshift stage, their melodies weaving through the hum of conversation. Margot's workshop drew a crowd of eager children. She guided them in creating lanterns shaped like animals, stars, and even tiny boats. One little girl, shy and freckled, tugged on Margot's sleeve. "Do you think my lantern will float?" Margot knelt beside her, smiling. "I think it'll float beautifully, and it'll carry your wish across the lake." That evening, as the sky turned a deep indigo, the townsfolk gathered at the water's edge. Lanterns bobbed on the lake's surface, their flickering lights reflected like a constellation in the water. Ethan and Margot released their lanterns together, their hands brushing as they let them drift. "What did you wish for?" Ethan asked. Margot smiled, her eyes glistening. "I didn't need to. Everything I want is right here." An unexpected discovery won. Humid morning in late July, Ethan and Margot decided to explore the wooded trails that wound around the lake. Tango bounded ahead, his nose to the ground, while Ethan carried a backpack with sandwiches and a thermos of iced tea. As they ventured deeper into the woods, they stumbled upon an old stone foundation, overgrown with moss and wildflowers. "What do you think this was?" Margot asked, running her fingers over the weathered stone. Ethan crouched down, examining the structure. "Looks like it might have been a homestead, late 18th, maybe early 19th century." He pulled out his notebook, jotting down observations. The discovery thrilled him. It was a tangible connection to the past, something he could incorporate into his writing. Margot, meanwhile, took photos and made quick sketches, inspired by the interplay of history and nature. Later, they brought the site to Raymond's attention at the Historical Society. Together, they uncovered records of a family who had settled there in 1798, only to abandon the homestead during a particularly harsh winter. Their discovery sparked an idea for Ethan's next book, a multi-generational story centered on the lives of families who had called the lake home. Building bridges. In the community, as summer stretched on, Ethan and Margot became more deeply woven into the fabric of Greenhaven. Margot's workshops expanded to include evening classes for adults, drawing a lively mix of participants. Among them was Naomi, a widowed schoolteacher who found solace in painting. During one session, Naomi confided, "I never thought I could create something beautiful again. But this feels like hope." Margot realized her work was about more than teaching techniques. It was about helping people rediscover their inner light. Ethan, meanwhile, grew closer to Raymond and the other members of the Historical Society. Their weekly meetings often turned into late-night discussions over coffee, debating everything from local legends to the ethics of historical fiction. The storm. Not every moment of their first summer was idyllic. One August evening, a sudden Storm rolled in, its winds whipping through the trees and sending waves crashing against the shore. As the storm intensified, the power went out, plunging the cottage into darkness. Ethan and Margot lit candles and huddled together by the fireplace. Tango curled at their feet. "I used to hate storms," Margot admitted, her voice barely audible, over the wind. "They always made me feel small, out of control." Ethan took her hand. But now, autumn's arrival. As the vibrant greens of summer gave way to the fiery reds, oranges, and yellows of autumn, Greenhaven seemed to transform into an entirely new world. Crisp mornings were spent sipping hot coffee on the porch, their breath mingling with the cool air, while afternoons were filled with the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot during long walks through the woods. Ethan and Margot found themselves busier than ever. Margot's studio buzzed with students eager to capture the autumn colors, while Ethan threw himself into researching his novel. The story of the family who had once lived in the abandoned homestead began to take shape. A tale of survival, love, and loss against the backdrop of the Revolutionary War. Margot's community showcase. One day, Lila the florist suggested an idea to Margot. An autumn art showcase where local artists could display their work in the town square. Margot loved the idea and threw herself into organizing the event. Flyers were printed, invitations sent, and the square was transformed into an open-air gallery. On the day of the showcase, the square brimmed with life. Paintings, sculptures, and photographs adorned wooden easels and tables, while local musicians played gentle tunes in the background. Margot's students beamed with pride as they displayed their work, and the townsfolk were eager to purchase pieces, turning the event into a resounding success. Toward the end of the day, Naomi, the widowed schoolteacher, approached Margot with a watercolor painting of a solitary oak tree standing in a field of golden grass. "I made this for you," Naomi said softly. "You reminded me that even when everything changes, there's still beauty to be found." Margot blinked back tears as she accepted the gift. "It's beautiful, Naomi. Thank you." Ethan's breakthrough. For weeks, Ethan had been struggling with the emotional core of his novel. While the plot and characters were strong, he felt something was missing, a thread to tie it all together. One evening, as he sorted through the historical documents from the Greenhaven Historical Society, he came across a letter written by the mother of the family who had lived in the homestead. The letter described her fears during the harsh winter of 1803, when food was scarce and her children fell ill. But it also spoke of her unwavering hope, her belief that spring would come and bring new life to the land. The letter struck a chord in Ethan. It was the thread he had been searching for, a testament to resilience, love, and the human spirit. Inspired, he stayed up late that night, weaving the letter into his story. For the first time in months, the words flowed effortlessly. A visit from Isla. Just as they began to settle into the rhythm of autumn, Isla returned. This time her visit was planned. She wanted to see the life Ethan and Margot had built in Vermont. Isla arrived in a sleek rental car, her polished city, style contrasting with the rustic charm of the cottage. Over dinner, she shared stories of her latest adventures, but Ethan noticed something different about her. She seemed restless, as if searching for something she couldn't quite name. After dinner, as Margot cleaned up, Isla and Ethan sat on the porch, the cool night air filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. "You seem happy," Isla said, breaking the silence. "I am," Ethan replied. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Isla nodded, a wistful smile playing on her lips. "That's good. You deserve it." "What about you?" Ethan asked. "Are you happy?" Isla hesitated, her gaze fixed on the dark outline of the lake. "I'm figuring it out. Being Here, seeing you and Margot, it makes me realize how much I've been running. Maybe it's time to stop." Ethan didn't press her, but the conversation lingered in his mind long after Isla had left. The first frost. As October turned to November, the first frost of the season blanketed Greenhaven. The lake, once a shimmering mirror, now reflected the pale silver of early morning. Ethan and Margot prepared for the winter ahead, stacking firewood and sealing the windows of the cottage. One frosty morning, Margot found Ethan standing on the porch, a steaming mug in his hand. He was staring out at the lake, lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him. Ethan smiled. "Just thinking about how far we've come, how much has changed." Margot kissed his cheek. "Change isn't always bad. Sometimes it's exactly what we need. A new chapter." By the time winter arrived, Ethan had finished the first draft of his novel. He dedicated it to the people of Greenhaven, whose stories and spirit had inspired him. Margot, too, felt a sense of accomplishment as her studio continued to thrive, becoming a sanctuary for the town's artists. Together they had found not just a home, but a community, and winter's embrace. As the first heavy snow blanketed Greenhaven, the town transformed into a winter wonderland. Icicles clung to the eaves of cottages, and the lake froze into a glassy expanse that reflected the pale blue of the sky. Life slowed, but it did not stop. Ethan and Margot embraced the rhythm of winter in Vermont. Mornings were spent sipping coffee by the fireplace, while evenings brought games of chess and long conversations under the glow of candlelight. The isolation of winter felt comforting rather than lonely, a stark contrast to the disconnected busyness of their lives in the city. The frozen lake became the center of the community's activities. Children bundled in puffy coats and woolen hats skated across the ice, their laughter echoing through the trees. Margot joined a group of locals who practiced ice sculpting, while Ethan, inspired by the serene beauty of the season, began jotting down notes for a sequel to his novel. The release of Ethan's novel. In January, Ethan's novel, Beneath the Winter Sky, was released. It was a sweeping historical fiction, centered on the family who had lived in the homestead, weaving their struggles and triumphs into a tale of resilience and hope. The novel received praise from critics and readers alike, with many noting how vividly Ethan brought the landscape of Vermont to life. A glowing review in a national publication led to a surge in sales, and Ethan found himself thrust into the literary spotlight once again. Despite the accolades, Ethan remained humble. The success felt different this time, more grounded. Greenhaven had taught him that the greatest stories came not from chasing acclaim, but from listening to the whispers of the past and the present. At Margot's suggestion, Ethan hosted a book signing at the local library. The event was intimate, but heartfelt, with neighbors and friends showing up to support him. Harold, the elderly neighbor, had tears in his eyes as he handed Ethan his copy. "I've lived in Greenhaven my whole life," Harold said, "but your book made me see it in a new light. Thank you." A winter retreat. In late February, Margot proposed an idea, a winter creativity retreat at their cottage. The retreat would bring together artists, writers, and musicians for a weekend of collaboration and inspiration. Margot spent weeks preparing, transforming their home into a cozy haven. She strung fairy lights along the porch, filled every room with blankets and cushions, and stocked the kitchen with hot cocoa, homemade bread, and hearty stews. When the weekend arrived, a diverse group of individuals filled the cottage. Caleb, the musician, brought his guitar and composed hauntingly beautiful melodies by the fire. Lila the florist tried her hand at painting, creating abstract works inspired by the stark beauty of winter. Ethan hosted a writing workshop, guiding participants through the art of storytelling. Margot's art classes encouraged everyone to experiment with mediums they'd never tried before. The retreat buzzed with creativity, the walls of the cottage, resonating with laughter, music, and the scratch of pens and brushes. On the final night, the group gathered around the fire pit outside, bundled in blankets as snowflakes drifted down. Caleb played a new song he'd written that weekend, the melody soft and mournful, and Ethan read an excerpt from his novel. "I think this is the most alive I've ever felt," Margot whispered to Ethan as the flames crackled before them. An unexpected letter. As spring approached, Ethan received a letter that took him by surprise. It was from Isla. The letter was warm and reflective, filled with updates on her life in the city. Isla wrote about taking a step back from her career to focus on herself, mentioning how inspired she'd been by her visit to Vermont. "I wanted to thank you both," Isla wrote. "Being with you and Margot reminded me of what I truly value: connection, purpose, and creativity. I've started painting again, and I've even joined a little art group in Brooklyn. It's not Greenhaven, but it's a start." The letter left Ethan thoughtful. Isla's words felt like a reminder of how far he and Margot had come, and how the choices they'd made had rippled outward, touching others in ways they couldn't have imagined. The thaw and new beginnings. As winter gave way to spring, Ethan and Margot found themselves dreaming of new projects. Margot wanted to expand her studio, offering residencies for visiting artists, while Ethan toyed with the idea of writing a non-fiction book about Greenhaven's history. One morning, as they walked along the lake's edge, now thawed and shimmering under the sunlight, Margot stopped and turned to Ethan. "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing this?" she asked, her voice quiet. Ethan nodded, taking her hand in his. "All the time. But I think that's what makes it so precious." They stood there for a while, watching the water ripple in the gentle breeze.